A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, 4 nerds gathered together to talk about the latest Star Wars movie, Rogue One. Now, who were those nerds? It's Sludge.
It's Sling.
Smith John.
And Ellum, I guess?
If it wasn't blatantly obvious, spoiler warning if you haven't seen the movie. It was a movie between episodes 3, which is the best movie of all time, and episode 4, which is the worst movie of all time.
Yeah, that's the general consensus of people.
All joking aside, I'm actually really curious. So I just literally went to see the movie today. I'd heard mixed things. I'd heard people liking it. I've heard people not liking it. I'm curious, what exactly makes you guys like it and not like it?
When I went to see it, all I'd heard were positive things about it from people that were saying, oh, it's, even better than The Force Awakens, It's it's the best Star Wars movie ever. And then I saw it. I saw it with my family as well, and usually what happens after we watch a movie is that, my dad will ask me, oh, what do you think of the film? Did you like it? And it'll usually take me a lot of time to overanalyze the film and every aspect of it and not try to give, a binary answer to that. I looked him straight in the eye and said, no. I don't like this film, but I'm glad I saw it, because now I can talk about it on the podcast. And that's not a good reason, I think, to necessarily, watch something.
Full disclosure, Waj and I have already discussed this at some length, and we pretty much agree on everything.
Yeah, I think so.
Basically, the characters weren't really that interesting, and the other characters weren't interesting, and there were some good action scenes, and the characters weren't very interesting.
I mean, that's, pretty much the heart of it for me, but I don't know. Ellen, what do you think?
I think that I am really invested in the Star Wars universe, and going into Rogue One, especially the first time around, I really, really, really wanted to like it. It was the kind of thing where that was severely tainting my first viewing especially, and I will say that I really enjoyed it the first time around. I was like, there's a lot of different stuff in this movie that just, as a Star Wars fan, I have always wanted to see. A lot of the combat is in situations that we've never really seen before. It introduces a lot of character concepts, at least conceptually, and also takes old characters in new directions that we haven't really seen before. There's just a lot of small stuff in this movie that I really like, from the ships to the locations to just a lot of, I guess you could say, the fluff that I really enjoy about it. But I went to see the movie a second time with my family. My sister's a relatively big Star Wars fan, but we both really like talking about movies and talking about stories that we experienced together. And she said something that really kind of hits it on the nose. The problem with this movie is that it's about a team who basically have to go steal the Death Star plans, but they don't really get enough time to bond together as a team. You can have uninteresting characters, and I don't think that there's really enough time in a 2-hour movie to flesh out, 6 main cast members?
I disagree, but we can get to that in a minute.
They can have a really entertaining dynamic if they have relational dynamics together, either if they have significant conflict or if they just have stuff that works together, and we don't really get to see that enough in this movie. And I think Waj and John, you're right in that what we do see of the characters doesn't by itself make us kind of get invested in them. But again, it's the kind of movie that I really want to like, and similar to the prequels, I have a weird relationship with the Star Wars prequels where I have seen so much hate for them over the years, and I kind of grew up with them, and I still see them with nostalgia. But at the same time, I also see them for a lot of their sometimes few and far between good elements, especially when it comes down to things like the visuals. And Rogue One is similar to that. I think that it does a lot of things better than the prequels, but ultimately, it's the kind of movie that, for me at least, is best to cherry pick from. As a movie, I don't think it works the greatest, but it's got a lot of really cool elements.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's definitely better than the prequels, as much hate as I might like to give it. And there are definitely things that I did like about it. I liked that it explained why the Death Star had such a big weakness. I mean, I don't think that really had to be explained, but it was cool that they did it. I liked the idea of tying it in directly to the beginning of episode 4, even though I'm a little skeptical about the way they did it.
I've heard some complaints about the first quarter of the movie and just how much stuff the movie tries to throw at you. And so what did you guys think of the first part of the movie?
The thing about introducing the characters, they did it in such a short span of time. After the Rogue One title shows up on screen, 5 minutes later, we have most of the characters, I think. think it could have been more evenly distributed, or perhaps some of the characters could have been cut entirely, which I think there are quite a few extraneous characters that don't do much. One thing that I actually did think wasn't that great was the titles that were overlaid over the planets and their names and their function. I thought that was kind of a weakness of the film in a way, that like the actual environments, they're not that distinct, that they have to like tell you where you are. There's other ways to do that, I think. It adds nothing, in my opinion. Okay, there's another planet that has a thing, then I'm like, oh, okay, cool. It's usually not even something that's related to what actually happens in the film, or at least as far as I can recall.
I would disagree with you on that point. I don't know, like, I'm not super huge into Star Wars. I'm not, like, amazingly big into the lore and haven't read all the books and all the EU stuff. I've barely watched all the movies, a little bit of Clone Wars here and there, but, like, I'm not super huge into the lore. Having said that, my problem with The Force Awakens was that it was just sort of like, here's a planet, boom. It's a desert planet. Is it Tatooine? I don't know. It's a planet. We don't really know what it is, who it is, or why it is, but it's there. At least with this, you sort of get a little bit of context as to, like, this is a planet, this is what it does. Now you have the context for that. And I mean, yeah, there are other ways that you can do that, but in the way that the movie was set up, I felt like it was perfectly fine way to do that. If you're taking the time to like set up every single planet, explaining it through the movie, then you're just not going to have enough time. You're going to be left with like 2 planets.
I honestly would have preferred that.
Yeah.
Because there's way too many.
There are a lot of planets. It's just that I think that my biggest problem with this movie is really that so much of it doesn't have as much impact as it could have. Both in terms of the characters and in terms of a lot of the actions and events that happen. Like, they don't feel like they have kind of the narrative cohesion of this happens, therefore it makes this other thing happen and then creates a problem that the characters must solve, but then another problem arises. It's more like there are all of these character moments and all of these story beats that have to be put together, and sometimes it doesn't feel very natural how things flow.
Yeah, it just kind of feels like, oh, it's because this is a movie, so this is the scene where the protagonists are like, they have feelings for each other, I guess, maybe, but it's like, no, I don't believe it. Like, at the end there.
That was actually one of the sequences that bothered me the least, but yeah, I get your point.
The characters, I think, are my main gripe, I suppose, where I felt nothing towards most of the characters. I've seen people herald K2SO as like, oh, he's like the greatest comic relief character ever, or something like that.
I liked him.
Like, no, it's just because throughout the movie there was almost no humor at all, and so whenever K2SO did show up or talk, it's like, oh, there's something that actually makes me feel like feelings, you know, instead of just nothing, which I felt throughout the movie. Just boredom.
K2SO and the blind dude were the only characters who made me feel anything when they died.
K2SO, yes. Blind Asian dude, yes. I extend that to Red Armor Guy. See, it's bad when you don't even know the main characters.
Yeah.
I have a problem with the names because I can't remember any of them.
Red Armor Guy and Asian Jedi, they had a good connection relationship, but it's never really explored.
It was obvious what they were trying to do with him, but it was like a Cliff's Notes version of a character arc.
I actually didn't think that the blind Jedi guy was actually any good. I didn't like his character. When I have said that, people are like, oh, well, what about that scene where one of the troopers puts a bag over his head and he's like, oh, but I'm blind. Are you serious? Like, oh, that's a little comedic moment. And I will agree, I like that moment, but there's pretty much nothing else like that throughout the film. Only one scene that's like a likable character moment, and then all of the rest of the scenes are just him repeating the same lines over and over. I just kind of found that annoying.
You found repeating the same thing over and over annoying?
Yeah, I know.
You found the same thing repeating over and over annoying?
Yeah, I know. With the 2 Asian dudes, I don't know, I felt like they probably could have been cut.
What? No. I totally disagree with that.
Okay, maybe not. I don't know.
Something I want to say that I haven't seen or heard brought up very much is that blind Asian dude is very, very similar to one of the characters from The Matrix 2. Like, he doesn't exactly feel ripped off, but he kind of does. And I think it's kind of a bad sign when one of your most notable characters is a not as good copy of a character from a not very good movie.
I overall thought the movie was alright. I will say that the characters were definitely the weakest part. I almost wonder if they had that rewrite like halfway through shooting or something like that. But I don't know. The setting is something that I personally enjoyed a lot. And just, it felt very Star Wars, especially very original series-ish. Like, it's very difficult to describe as far as atmosphere goes.
Would you say that the atmosphere is similar to what they did with The Force Awakens?
Yes and no, because at the same time, it feels a bit like The Force Awakens, but at the same time, it felt older in a lot of ways. Not sure exactly why that is, other than the fact that obviously it takes place before The Force Awakens.
I think it had a lot to do with production design choices. Like, they went out of their way to make Darth Vader's costume look kind of cheap, like it does in the original movie.
Yeah.
Not to mention his voice being the same, as opposed to changing it to be, like, less dorky. Going back to characters, I was going to say, if I could cut out any one character from the movie, I'd be Goggles Guy, who
Bodhi,
delivers the
pilot?
message. Yeah, pilot guy.
Oh yeah, I would
He,
too.
to me, he didn't contribute much of anything other than, like, being a plot device.
The thing about him as well is that he gets brainwashed by that weird squid thing, and it amounts to nothing. Oh, it could mess with his mind, but does
not.
it? He's just kind of functional.
He seems a little hungover when they're in prison and they break out, but then after that, nothing.
It's a very good example of this movie's problems that, from what I have heard, have been fixed in the novelization. I have yet to read it, but apparently, like, say, Bodhi's whole sequence where he gets brainwashed by the boar gullet is a lot more drawn out and works a lot better because you can get inside the character's head. And I feel like a lot of the characters in this movie would work so much better if we could just get a little glimpse into their head to really see, like, their motivations and kind of what they're thinking throughout all this. That's the kind of stuff that works a lot more in a novel than it does in a movie. So I'm just wondering whether this story, like the overall story, even though of course there's several things that you couldn't do in a novel, I'm wondering if just the characters especially and the overall feeling of the story would work better in the novel version.
Yes and no. Something I want to say that I kind of alluded to earlier is that you brought up how hard it was to juggle a large cast of characters in a 2-hour movie and have them all be interesting. I think you can definitely do that. It just takes good writing. While I was watching this movie, I kept comparing it to movies like The Magnificent Seven and Seven Samurai that have large casts on suicide missions, and most of them die at the end. All the main characters in those movies are really well developed and feel like real people. To be fair, Seven Samurai is like 3 hours long, but Magnificent Seven, I think, is about 2 hours, and it does a much better job of handling its characters than Rogue One does, despite a similar setup and similar time constraints. It's been a long time since I've seen Magnificent Seven, so I can't cite specific examples too well, but regarding like what you were saying about needing insight into like their internal thoughts and beliefs or whatever. In the original Ghostbusters movie, the fourth Ghostbuster, whose name I can't even remember, doesn't have very much screen time, but he has this one really good scene in the middle of the movie where he's talking with Dan Aykroyd's character about like how this is the end of the world and like their religious beliefs and stuff. And it does a really good job of like establishing him as kind of a down-to-earth, ordinary guy. And it makes him a memorable character even though he's not in the movie that much.
So often it just takes one scene, right?
One really good scene. Yeah.
If you guys were like placed in the screenwriter's room and told like, hey, we realize that this plot we have for Rogue One isn't really working, please help us fix it, what would you do to salvage a movie like Rogue One?
I would probably remove some of the characters to make it more
Why?
simple. Yeah, because, like, okay, that's what I would do. If I were put in the position, I'm like, okay, there are too many extraneous characters that do not much. We can just take them out and focus on the protagonist person, Jyn Erso, and I guess Cassian. And even though I thought the Asian guy could have been cut, the blind ninja guy, I don't know, maybe not, I suppose. In terms of what you were saying with one good scene that could probably define that character, I actually thought that guy had the best scene for establishing his character, where he was just kind of dodging like the stormtrooper fire, just sensing it. That's a good scene. But then every other scene, it's like, oh, the force is with me, I am one with the force or something. And I'm like, oh, I kind of liked it better when he didn't talk. I'm really struggling to think of like any other moment for any of the other characters where I'm like, oh, that's a defining character moment.
For a lot of the characters, I think it would require almost rewriting them from the ground up. Like, what do we actually know about the pilot dude?
He's a pilot!
He is a pilot.
He defected, I guess, after seeing how the Empire was going to, use the Death Star to blow up planets. I think he was the one character that was really just brought along for the ride. Actually, now that I think about it, the pilot, Bodhi, and Baze and Sherwood, the two Asian dudes, they were all kind of brought along for the ride, but the pilot especially, he was brought along for the ride, and then at the end, at the Battle of Scarif, he had his heroic moment where he connected the communications device thing, and then he blew up. You're right in saying that he doesn't really have that much of a character to work with. And Waj, you brought up an interesting point of just writing out several of the characters entirely. I'm really wondering now, how would this movie work if it centered around just Jin and Cassian, and maybe K2SO, throughout the entirety of the movie?
I suppose if there were fewer characters, it would be much easier to follow, kind of like the originals, now that I think about it. Although I guess there were Chewie and R2-D2 and C-3PO. In terms of the main cast, there were 3. There's Luke, Leia, and Han. I think that could probably work if there was that simpler setup.
Because when you think about it, what does Chewbacca really do in any of the movies in terms of characterization? He's just Han's co-pilot. He doesn't really have any character, and yet people love him.
Yeah, I think the reason is because he's not a human character. In a similar way, the muscle guy, whatever his name was, kinda was like that, but just had no redeeming qualities. With Chewbacca, he's a furry bear guy, and it's oh, he's beating up the bad guys. But with this guy, he's just kind of a stoic Asian dude that's kind of just standing around and maybe runs and kicks a guy. I don't know. What am I supposed to attach to, I guess, with these characters?
The red guy wouldn't be that hard to fix, I don't think. Just give him a speech about his little schism with the blind dude. That gives us insight into their disagreement.
Yeah, it's definitely alluded to when they're introduced, where it's oh, the Force is with me. Oh, no, I'm with you. I'm the one who saved you. And then that's just sort of it. It could have done more.
Yeah.
Rogue One! The title could have done more!
Pretty much, yeah. And that's what really makes me sad about this movie, because as I said nearer to the beginning, there's a lot of stuff that I want to like, and there's a lot of stuff that I do like, but overall, it doesn't kind of reach its potential.
It definitely did have potential, you're right. Although one of the other characters that I thought was extraneous, and I don't know if you guys would agree, the guy on Jeddah that has the breathing problem.
Saw Gerrera, the revolutionary dude?
Yeah.
I agree with you there. He actually has more Star Wars backstory, he was introduced in prior Star Wars content, but it feels to me like it's a character who, essentially, we kind of got to see his origins during the Clone Wars. Spoilers for anybody who hasn't really seen the Clone Wars. And then we see kind of his death here. But the problem, I think, is that there's not very much meat in between. There's not very much leading up to Saw Gerrera. It's established that, he splintered from the rest of the rebellion. He's more violent. He's more extreme. And you see that, the guy looks almost unhinged. But we don't have enough time with him in order to really feel his death the way maybe we should. But I think that's going to be fixed because they are releasing more content that includes Saw Gerrera. And again, so many of these movies' problems, I feel, would be fixed by just more kind of ancillary content.
What do you mean, more content?
Rogue One is the kind of movie that does not really work very well on its own, which is really ironic considering, it's a standalone movie, but both in terms of some of the character continuity, because the main cast, we've never seen them before, but so many of the secondary characters are returning characters, and it's the kind of saga continuity that if you really pay attention and you like all of these background characters, you're going to get, but you have to have all of that kind of supplemental material, I feel, to really get the most out of Rogue One. That's kind of a shame.
That's what I had speculated. If you were more immersed with the Star Wars lore and you had seen these characters before and knew their backstories or whatever, that you'd probably find a lot more out of the movie because it has a lot of that. But I'm completely oblivious to it because I'm just a casual Star Wars fan.
A really well-written movie would find a way to make you care about those secondary characters, even if you are a noob or whatever.
Indeed, yeah.
I'd say that The Force Awakens did a pretty decent job with that. One thing I wanted to ask you guys about, though, that we really have not touched upon is the villains. What did you guys think of the villains?
Grand Moff Tarkin should not have been made CG. That looks so fake. I knew it was coming because I'd heard about it, and I was just he looks like a cartoon character.
They just wanted it to tie into Rebels.
There was the tie into Rebels, there was the tie tie into A New Hope. Again, this movie seems so much about continuity, which is, like we said, a shame. They released a prequel novel, Catalyst, which goes into a lot of like Tarkin and the other guy Krennic's kind of rivalry and the whole thing with Galen Erso and how he started working on the Death Star. It goes into all of these characters. It provides a lot more context that is really useful for appreciating the movie. But with Tarkin, I don't know. I guess it's just because I was bracing myself for it and it works that way.
I knew Leia was coming too, but with Leia at the end, I didn't mind it because the CG wasn't bad. But with Tarkin,
Really?
I thought
it was
Leia
bad.
looked a lot worse than Tarkin. I thought what was clever about what they did with Tarkin was that they kept his face in shadow and low-key
Exactly.
lighting most of the time. There were a few times when it was clearly illuminated and then it did look really fake. But most of the time I thought it was okay.
The visual effects artists who were working on this probably were working on it for so long and put so much energy into it that, like any kind of creative thing you do, they eventually lost the ability to objectively critique it. It's like, oh, this is awesome. We're bringing Tarkin and young Leia back into live action. Yay. It just became so normal to them to see these characters like this. They weren't able to step back and say, maybe we should put Tarkin in shadow a bit more. But they did what they did, and the movie wound up the way that it was.
I didn't feel like there was really a villain, even though there was that guy with the white cape.
You didn't think Krennic was a villain?
Yeah, I really did not. I was like, oh, is he the bad guy, I guess? But then there's like Tarkin, and then there's Vader in there for some reason.
Here's my problem with Krennic. If this were a serious, gritty war drama, I think he would be a good villain for that kind of movie. And the movie kind of thinks it's a serious, gritty war drama, but it really is also a silly action-adventure movie. And a silly action-adventure movie, I think, needs more of a physically intimidating antagonist for the good guys to fight.
Well, we got the Death Troopers. Krennic is more like the brains. The Death Troopers are more like the brawn.
The movie gives us no real reason to care about them.
Does it need to?
Yes.
Like, how do you mean?
Like, you can't just say, these are bad villains, they are bad.
There need to be personal stakes involved for the heroes in their fight against the big bad guy.
That's kind of one problem that I had with the movie is that with this sort of thing, you're given the opportunity to show, like, exactly why is it that all these rebels fight so much against the Empire? Because you don't really see that in Episode 3. You don't really see that in Episode 4. I mean, apart from the whole blowing up planets thing, but, like, even then, that's not really fully explored, and it's just sort of like, oh, they blew up a planet. Gosh darn. Oh well. What would work perfectly, in my opinion, is like just showing that the Empire is bad and that stormtroopers beating up innocent people for like no reason other than the fact that they can. Stuff like that shows you like, okay, this is why the Empire is bad. This is why they need to stop them. And as opposed to like, oh, they've got a big giant ball in the sky that can destroy planets.
The movie kind of takes for granted that, like, culturally we all know the Empire is bad. But it doesn't really see a reason to show us that the Empire is bad because we're supposed to already know it.
Right, but at what point do we learn that the Empire is bad? Because we assume that it's just sort of bad in A New Hope, right?
There's the scene where Krennic kills all the scientists.
Yeah, that's true.
There's just not really a whole lot of reason given as to why you should care about, like, why is the Empire bad? Because what this movie does is it plays a lot with the concept of what is good and what is bad. It plays with, you know, are the rebels actually good? And the answer by the end of it is maybe not, which is not a great thing to have at the ending. Going into the next movie where you assume that they're good.
How do you mean maybe not?
It's explained that, like, the one dude who was like, just kill the dude, and then he's never said, oh no, that was a bad idea. And no one's ever like that. And then they decide not to go for the plans, and then by the end of it, they're just sort of like, oh, well, we're being forced to go for the plans now. I guess we're going for the plans. And then that's that.
The thing about movies, or stories, I guess, is that, for me at least, characters are usually at the forefront, and I'm like, okay, I look for really good characters. But if the characters aren't that great, then the next thing I look for is the concepts or ideas or themes explored. And, like, the thing about you saying that the rebels' moral stance is kind of ambiguous, in a way, I also felt that, but I felt like that was an unintentional side effect of how the movie portrayed the rebels and what they did. That wasn't actually meant to be a thing. I'm like, okay, it's an interesting idea. It is a thing that I'm like, oh, that's intriguing. They're playing with this idea of maybe the rebels aren't that great. But it's not their intention. Like, they're still trying to make out that the rebels are the good guys and stuff. I'm like, oh, but it would have been so much better, I think, if that was actually a plot point or something like that. As far as I can tell, that was unintentional.
Even if the moral moral grayness were intentional, I don't think that's really right for Star Wars. Before this movie, Star Wars has pretty much always been a very straightforward good versus evil thing, primarily targeted at kids. That's not to say, like, demean it and say, oh, it's just a stupid kid series or something. Like, no, they're great movies, but the morality is typically very black and white, and I think that's what works for the Star Wars universe. I just don't think adding so much grayness really fits. That's more the realm of Star Trek, really.
I see what you mean, but at the same time, I disagree that there isn't a precedent for this. With the prequels, with the Clone Wars, we had the Republic, which was corrupt, and the Separatists, which were supposedly the evil guys. Oh, they have droids, oh, they have Sith, but ideologically, they had very sound reasons for wanting to separate from the Republic, and ultimately both sides were being manipulated by Darth Sidious.
That's true. Two counter arguments. One, that wasn't presented well in the movies at all.
Yeah, that was not, no.
Which are the main things I'm concerned with. My second point was that even in that situation, Palpatine is unambiguously evil.
True. It was less about the government at that stage and more about just the characters who were good, like, Luke and Yoda and Obi-Wan against the Emperor.
Why is Vader there? For fan service reasons. Like, that's pretty much it. That seems to be the case, because, like, you could just kind of cut him out and nothing in the movie would really be different.
I totally agree. You could just cut his parts out of the movie. It would change nothing. Having said that, what I like about this movie is the atmosphere and the tone it sets up for the original trilogy. And for that reason, that's why I enjoy Darth Vader's inclusion into this. We don't really get a whole lot of look at Darth Vader outside of, at the end of episode 3, for like 2 seconds. You just don't really get to see the side of, like, why is everyone terrified of Darth Vader? Mm-hmm. The one scene where he's going through and trying to catch the ship as they pull away, where he's, like, ripping through the rebel soldiers, that just gives, like, okay, this is why we're terrified of him, because he can literally rip through people like paper.
My problem with that was that he never did anything remotely like that in the original movies, and it felt kind of incongruous to me.
I agree. It's incongruous because he doesn't do that. And that's a problem with the original series, in my opinion. Because you have this main antagonist who it's like, oh, he's bad, he's evil, ooh, spooky. And he's supposed to be like the most powerful Sith. And like, you get nothing other than do this, do that. I'm bad.
And he like waves his lightsaber at Luke a couple times,
Why were the AT-ATs so cool in episode 5? Beyond just like being giant walking tanks, they weren't trying to make them seem cool, they just were cool.
It was almost like an accident that they appeared so cool.
Not exactly an accident, but kind of. Like, it was an unavoidable consequence of their role in the story. And in Rogue One, the AT-ATs are there just to be cool. They don't really have much other reason to be there. And I feel like the Darth Vader scene has the same problem in Rogue One. It's just supposed to look cool. Doesn't really matter if it makes that much sense or fits in with the rest of the movie. I think that's something that really bothers me about it.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of style over substance, to be honest.
We're getting a new Star Wars movie every year, pretty much, from here on out. So what does Rogue One spell for the future of the franchise?
I'm definitely a little bit worried. I did think Force Awakens was really good, so I'm not without hope, but I am much more skeptical than I was.
Now that I've seen Rogue One and what the Anthology series seems to have in store, I am even less enthused by the young Han Solo movie. Will I go watch it? Probably not.
As far as the Han Solo movie goes, from what I recall, it's being written or co-written by Lawrence Kasdan, who wrote episode 5, 6, and 7. So I have a little bit of faith in that one.
The Han Solo movie will be amazing if he says the lines, "I'm feeling like a star, you can't stop my shine. I'm loving Cloud City, my head's in the sky. I'm Solo, I'm Han Solo.
Oh my gosh.
Han Solo. I'm Han Solo, Solo."
Thanks for listening. That was Rogue One. Don't watch it.
No, if you like Star Wars, watch it.
Wait for the DVD.
Goodbye, everyone. Don't go rush. Rogue One, 'cause it's fun.